Welcome to the Institute of Sustainable Nutrition, and happy spring. We are so excited for this day, even though it may not be the most uplifting subject that you've heard in a while. It is one of the most important, I feel. Today is also the march for our children out against gun violence, and I think there could be a strong correlation between some of the things we're seeing with our children and the food that they're consuming. So this is kind of in solidarity for those children, or young adults. A number of you have asked me, who is the Institute of Sustainable Nutrition? We are a school, and we are in our 5th year here at Holcomb Farm. We offer a 1-year certification in sustainable health and nutrition. So we teach the science of nutrition, looking at the human body, teaching about detoxification in the immune system, and what is a carb, what's the difference between a plant protein and an animal protein. We look at different diets that are out there and try to point out the pros and cons of all of them. And we move into the garden where we teach sustainable, local gardening practices to grow more nutrient-rich food and herbs. We then move into the kitchen and teach culinary skills where we use those food and herbs to make a lot of traditional remedies, traditional dishes, fermentations. How do you extend the harvest with all of the beautiful food you get in the fall? That's where we have a lot of guest speakers, chefs who come in and teach different skills. We then have kitchen medicine. And these are the skills that once upon a time, every household knew. They knew how to take the food, and they knew how to take the herbs and make remedies and delicious foods that would heal. They used food and herb as their medicine. And so we teach those skills again, and we do a lot of that with foraging. We take people out and try to teach them some of the wild foods that are still some of the most nutrient-dense foods we have out there. And quite exciting to be outside and find something growing in the lawn that you get to eat. It really is quite a thrill for some of us. I do just want to quickly point out Allison Burks over here. She is on our staff. She is our science and co-teaches the herb class. Forager, all-around brilliant woman. And Nigel Palmer sitting up here in the front, who I have to give credit for this day. He began this whole thing, and we are also grateful to him for following through with this. He is our outdoor consultant, and he teaches the gardening portion, and he also gets everyone to start remembering to look up at the night sky and to look down at the ground and look at the bacteria in the soil. So he really is our outdoor consultant. And so today, we get to bring a couple of his and our gurus here to speak. So I'm going to let Nigel introduce them, and we'll go from there.
Thank you. Thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to thank all of you for participating in this event. To show up here and have an interest is the first big step into understanding some of the issues that are in front of us. I'd also like to thank many of the supporters that helped us put this thing together. We've received some very generous donations, and we've received some excellent help from not only the students at the Institute, but also many in the community. So thank you all for that. As a note, there's bathrooms through that door, through the next door, and on the right-hand side. We have tea and coffee and cider. And I I think that's about it. Water, we have water. Actually, the water here is fairly good. Okay, there's an awful lot of scientific information going to be presented here today. So we are going to have a generous question and answer period with the hopes of generating conversation to try and answer some of the questions that are here. And let me think. That's about it. So, I just did. All right. Our first guest is a senior researcher at the Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Research Center at MIT. She has undergraduate degrees in biophysics. Her PhDs are in computer science and electrical engineering. I really like this combination because we're talking about a quintessential connect the dotter. Taking the available data that's out there and putting it into a form in a way that simple people like myself can understand. I'm really, really glad that Stephanie was able to join us today. She's internationally sought to talk about these things, and we're very grateful to have her come and speak with us today. Dr. Stephanie Senna.
Thank you all for coming. Very, very impressive to have a full house like this in what looks like a pretty remote area. So I'm very impressed. Can you guys hear me okay? Great, okay. So this is the title of my talk, Glyphosate, the safe herbicide that's making us all sick. I want to first speak about Don Huber because I want to say that he is the person who turned me on to glyphosate. I was looking at autism since 10 years ago. I've been trying to figure out what is causing the epidemic in autism. I looked at many different toxic chemicals in the environment. I understood that autism had a gut issue associated with it, and I could not figure out what was causing that. And it was very fortuitous that I happened to be at a conference in Indianapolis, Illinois, and Don Huber gave a talk. I was giving a talk on statin drugs, and he gave a talk on glyphosate. I did not know the word glyphosate when I walked into that room, and it changed my life. I heard his 2-hour talk, and I said, this is it. I have found the answer, and I'm right. I know I'm right. You'll see the evidence. Some of it today. I actually have much more about autism on my website and other talks that I've given. Today is a much broader picture. But glyphosate is doing much more harm to us than just autism. I am extremely concerned about it, and I think it needs to be banned worldwide. I'll just say that up front. So I just want to start with a quote from the New York Times. I was very happy to see this show up in the New York Times, very mainstream. The GMO experiment carried out in real time and with our entire food and ecological system as its laboratory is perhaps the greatest case of human hubris ever. It creates yet another systemic, too-big-to-fail enterprise, but one for which no bailouts will be possible when it fails. Good to see that in the New York Times. So here's an outline of my talk. I'll start with an introduction. I will then talk about glyphosate acting as a glycine analog. This is a theory. Anthony Samsel and I believe this is happening. And it explains so much about all the correlations we're seeing between glyphosate and a long list of debilitating diseases. We can explain each one of those diseases through this mechanism. It's an additional mechanism besides the things I was aware of before in terms of chelation, disrupting the gut microbes. It still does all of those things as well, but this is an insidious cumulative toxicity effect of glyphosate that is hurting us very, very, eroding our health very slowly over time. Then I will talk about food allergies and autoimmune diseases, which are a direct consequence of this feature of glyphosate. I'll talk about collagen and gelatin and the issues of glyphosate contaminating them. And then I'll talk about animals in distress, and then I'll finally have a section on how to protect yourself and also how to advocate against glyphosate. So the U.S. health status, we make up 5% of the world's population. We consume more than 50% of the world's pharmaceutical drugs. We spend more on healthcare than Japan, France, China, UK, Italy, Canada, Brazil, Spain, and Australia combined. We rank last or near last among the developed nations on infant mortality and life expectancy. We have the highest rate of death on the first day of life among all of the industrialized nations. We suffer from more chronic illnesses than any other country, and we consume 20% of the world's glyphosate. So the United States is, I think, #1 on glyphosate, the most exposed population. Canada may well be #2. So Roundup and GMO crops, what is glyphosate? How many in the room know what glyphosate is? Oh, that's good. So you know what Roundup is, right? That's glyphosate. Now, Roundup has glyphosate in it as its active ingredient. And of course, people can get it very easily to control the weeds in their yard. It's also used extensively on our food crops, particularly on our GMO Roundup Ready crops. And this includes corn, soy, canola, sugar beets, cotton, tobacco, and alfalfa. So these are some major crops that go into the processed food industry. They are engineered to be resistant. Otherwise, glyphosate kills all plants. So something that kills all plants, it would be surprising if it was non-toxic to humans, because plants and animals have a lot in common. This is just showing you that glyphosate, when you look at the chemicals being used in agriculture, glyphosate stands out because everything else is more or less steady. I mean, I'm looking at the collection of all of the herbicides at the top, the blue line, all of the insecticides on the bottom, the red line, and then the glyphosate is clearly going up dramatically compared to everything else. So it's the one that is most pervasive in our environment and also going up exponentially over time. And this is partly because the weeds are getting smart. And they are finding, they said that they would be using less toxic chemicals with these GMO engineering technique, but in fact they ended up using more because the weeds got smart among the GMO crops, and now they've had to use more and more glyphosate each year because the weeds take more to kill them. This is an interesting, and I don't know if you can see these numbers here, but this is a study of various toxic chemicals in a particular site in Canada, in British Columbia. And it's very unusual for them to actually measure for glyphosate. One of the things about glyphosate is that mostly the government thinks it's safe, and therefore they don't care how much there is. But here they actually did measure it. And AMPA, which is a breakdown product of glyphosate, those two red arrows show you the numbers they found for those two, compared with a whole bunch of other chemicals they also measured. And what stands out is that these numbers are huge. 2,000 to 9,000 and 3,000 to 6,000 for glyphosate and AMPA, compared to much smaller numbers for everything else. So this is the big one. This is the elephant in the room. And that was in 2003 to 2005. So it's only gotten worse since then. So this is a paper that Anthony Samsel and I published in 2013. It was our first paper together on glyphosate. I actually met up with Anthony shortly after I heard Don Huber's talk. And Anthony was already an expert on glyphosate, so I could hit the ground running. And he just poured papers into my brain, and I learned everything I could about glyphosate under his tutelage initially, and now I feel like, you know, I've read an enormous amount and know a lot more now than I did at that time. But we wrote this first paper, and we identified several features of glyphosate that would make it toxic. One is that it interferes with the cytochrome P450 enzymes in the liver. Those are called the CYP enzymes for short. These are really important enzymes for a lot of reasons, which I'll get to in a moment. Don, I'm sure, will be talking to you about mineral chelation. That was one thing he covered a lot in his talk. It messes up really many of the minerals that are essential with our enzymes. Our enzymes depend upon cobalt and iron and manganese and magnesium, all these minerals that you need in small amounts that are really, really important for activating the enzymes. Glyphosate messes all of them up. It interferes with the synthesis of aromatic amino acids. Those are the aromatic amino acids are essential amino acids that are produced by our microbes, or we get it from our food. Our own cells can't make them. And if we don't have enough, then we are going to have a problem with making our proteins. And critically, they also are precursors for the neurotransmitters and also for the B vitamin folate. It also disrupts sulfate synthesis and sulfate transport and causes a sulfur deficiency problem. Now, this is a chart that really has me quite terrified. This is the autism prevalence in among 6-year-olds in the United States. This is according to the IDEA. These kids get benefits in school because they're diagnosed with autism. That's the blue boxes. The red line is glyphosate usage on corn and soy crops over the previous 4 years. So that's indicating sort of the age of 2 to the age of 6 in that child's life. The correlation between these two curves is astonishing, 0.9972. It's 1.0 is the highest it can be. So extremely strong correlation between these two curves. People say correlation doesn't mean causation, and they dismiss it, but I don't think they should, because the correlation, you will not find this kind of correlation with anything else. I would challenge you to find another chemical in the environment that matches this well. So if you see that kind of correlation, then what you need to do is to find out what is the logical way in which this molecule could cause this disease. This is another example of dementia, which is very similar to autism, also going up dramatically. Really scary numbers as far as what percentage of our elderly people are now suffering from Alzheimer's or dementia. The red line here is the glyphosate. The yellow boxes are the deaths due to dementia, according to the US data. And the blue line is sort of a trend line of what we had before. So something is happening in the environment today that's causing this epidemic in dementia. These are some data from a paper by Nancy Swanson et al. She's a friend of mine, and this paper has over 30 figures in it. And most of those figures show correlations between glyphosate usage on core crops and another horrible disease. So many different diseases are correlated. As I mentioned, Alzheimer's and autism, and also various digestive issues and kidney failure and liver failure. But these four show 4 kinds of cancer: thyroid cancer, liver. So the red line is the glyphosate, and the blue line is the use of GMO, the growth in GMO Roundup-ready crops. And so you can see that in each of these cases, the disease is rising dramatically in step with the rise in these two things: thyroid cancer, liver cancer, kidney cancer, and bladder cancer. Now, the IARC in 2014 issued a statement that glyphosate is a probable carcinogen. And this stirred up a lot of trouble. Monsanto was very upset with this because, of course, they want to protect their product. And this paper just came out with commentary: IARC monographs program and public health under siege by corporate interests. And this is what's happening, is that the industry fights back really hard, and they make sure that these things never stick. And so what they're trying to do now basically is to dismantle the IARC. They want to discredit them, dismantle them, get rid of the evidence so that then we can continue to use glyphosate. It was 2015, sorry, I said 2014. 2015, IARC declared glyphosate a probable carcinogen. Monsanto sent a threatening letter of intimidation to their staff, and the EPA staff have been in collusion with Monsanto in order to downgrade the health hazards of glyphosate. And then a quote here: the interferences by economic interest in cancer evaluations conducted by public health institutions do not bode well for the free flow of scientific information that informs and protects the public and workers from clear risk of cancer. Glyphosate is an antibiotic. It's been patented as an antimicrobial agent. And I think it is playing a very important role in the issues that we're seeing right now with respect to antibiotic resistance among pathogens that we're getting infected with. What happens is when these pathogens are exposed to a chronic low dose of glyphosate, they develop a generic mechanism to expel all antibiotics, many different antibiotics besides glyphosate. So they can become resistant to penicillin because of exposure to glyphosate. And this picture just sort of illustrates that you start out with normal flora, or mostly blue, with just a few of these more resistant ones, but then the resistant ones gain population as the antibiotic removes the ones that don't have that resistance. So you eventually get this resistance gene throughout the population. So here's a picture of a field that's has a runaway growth of Palmer amaranth, which is a weed that has become a very big problem in the United States as resistant to glyphosate. Now, the solution to this, of course, is just to put in some more GMOs against some other herbicides so that you can throw something else on top of glyphosate and do a double hit. And of course, this also means we're going to be exposed to something else as well as glyphosate, another herbicide, probably equally toxic, and many people think they're more toxic than glyphosate. So here's, for example, Endless Duo, which is 2,4-D plus glyphosate. 2,4-D is a component of Agent Orange that was used in Vietnam. And so now they have this new product that will, first of all, these new seeds that are resistant to both of these chemicals, and then a new product, Endless Duo, that has both of those chemicals in it. Another one is dicamba. And how many have heard about the dicamba fiasco? Because there's a lot of issues with dicamba this year being rolled out in the Midwest. Dicamba plus Roundup, because of the resistance to Roundup, add dicamba, add a GMO resistance gene to dicamba, and now you've got a lot of trouble with the neighbors' crops because their crops are not protected and they're dying from the dicamba that's being sprayed next door. So glyphosate as a glycine analog, this is the thing that is really has me excited recently. And I figured this out, well, Anthony Samsel actually called me up about 2 years ago. And he said, you know, I think glyphosate is getting into proteins by mistake in place of glycine. And I was like, get out of here, Anthony, that's crazy. You know? And then I started thinking about it, you know, and I said, well, geez, it is a glycine molecule. Glyphosate is a glycine molecule. it has extra stuff stuck onto its nitrogen atom. So it's a modified glycine molecule. Glycine is an amino acid. It's one of the basic coding amino acids that build our proteins. And it's the smallest one. It doesn't have any side chains. A very simple amino acid. And so it's possible, I believe, that glyphosate could be put into the protein by mistake when the protein machinery is trying to make a protein and wants to put a glycine there, it grabs glyphosate by mistake. And if it does that, it's going to really mess up that protein. In some cases, certain proteins have certain glycines that are absolutely essential for them to perform correctly. And if you swap out glycine and put in glyphosate, it will destroy the protein's ability to do its job. And so, so there's the glyphosate that's going in according to the DNA code. There's a GGC code for glycine. You grab a glyphosate by mistake and you put it right into the protein chain. So this is glycine, very simple amino acid. And glyphosate, you can see, is just glycine with extra stuff stuck onto the nitrogen atom. So here's just a schematic of an enzyme with each of these little boxes is an amino acid, and we've got glyphosate, alanine, proline at the bottom. And then we have this shape that's making an active site where some substrate is supposed to fit. But what happens with glyphosate is that you've got extra stuff that might be sticking out into the site where the substrate is supposed to go. And that's going to prevent the substrate from getting in there. There won't be room. And that will mess up the enzyme's ability to do its job. And that's exactly what I think is going on with respect to the enzyme that is claimed to be the most important enzyme that kills the plants when they're exposed to glyphosate. This enzyme is called ESPS synthase. And it's EPSP synthase. Do I have that wrong? EPSP synthase, that's right. It's in the shikimate pathway. And the shikimate pathway is the pathway that produces the aromatic amino acids. And our gut microbes can do that, and so can the plants. The human cells don't have that pathway, and this is why Monsanto says that glyphosate is harmless to us. However, that pathway then contains this enzyme. This enzyme contains the glycine that's absolutely essential at the active site. And multiple species of plants and multiple species of microbes have figured out how to get around glyphosate by swapping out that glycine and putting in alanine there instead. They actually changed the DNA code for that protein to get rid of that glycine. And in doing that, they completely prevent glyphosate from harming that enzyme. And so here's a picture from a paper talking about E. coli, where they use this strategy. The collapsing curve on the left is the wild type E. coli, exposed to glyphosate at different levels here on the bottom. That's an exponential scale. So the glyphosate gets very high there at the right-hand side. As you add more glyphosate, the enzyme becomes less and less active. I think it's because more and more glyphosate molecules are getting into the protein in place of glycine. The one on the right changed the glycine into alanine, and now it's insensitive to glyphosate at any level, which is quite remarkable, I think. And this would be the most plausible way to explain that, is to say glyphosate is substituting for the glycine. Now, this is also very interesting. This is a study that Monsanto did in 1989. This was an unpublished study and was not available to the public. Anthony Samsel requested from the EPA to get a lot of data from Monsanto's early studies. He got a huge stack of data. Finally, the EPA agreed to give him this data. This paper was among them. A very interesting paper where they exposed these bluegill sunfish to labeled glyphosate, carbon-14 labeled glyphosate. And then they could look and see if it went into the tissues. If they saw a radio label in the tissues, it meant that the glyphosate was accumulating in the tissues. It was not simply going in and going out. This is very, very important. And they did find radio label in the tissues. And then they said, well, let's see if it's glyphosate. They tried to measure for the glyphosate, and they didn't find. Only 20% of the radio label was showing up as glyphosate. 80% was mysteriously something else. What was happening is the glyphosate, I think, was embedded in the protein itself, such that you couldn't see it. The methods that are looking for glyphosate expect an independent molecule. But because it was embedded in the protein chain, it didn't get detected. So they added proteolysis enzymes, proteinase K, to break up the proteins into individual amino acids. And then they were able to raise the amount that they recovered to 70%. So still 30% was missing, which was probably still bound to various peptides that didn't get completely broken down. But they were able to recover a lot more through this enzymatic action to break apart the protein, which again implies, and they even said themselves, so they said proteinase K hydrolyzes proteins into amino acids and into small peptides, so that would be shorter segments, suggesting that a significant portion of the 14C activity residing in the bluegill sunfish tissue was tightly associated with or incorporated into protein. So they use this term incorporated into, which is exactly what I'm saying. And they wrote that in 1989. They already had the idea that that might be happening. Now, they, of course, deny that this is possible. They say this is impossible, it's not happening. So this is why I want to push hard on this idea. If it's true, then we can explain all these different diseases that are going up in step with glyphosate exposure. So the CYP enzymes have essential glycines. And if they're missing, if they're impaired, then you get a problem with producing bile acids. This is the liver. In the liver, the CYP enzymes. You get vitamin D activation is impaired. And you get impaired ability to detoxify toxic chemicals, other toxic chemicals. You can explain neurological diseases such as autism and Alzheimer's based on this property. You can explain autoimmune diseases because you get these misfolded proteins because of the glyphosate getting into them. They become misfolded, and then they become immunogenic. And chronic fatigue syndrome is based on myosin. Myosin has an essential amino acid. If you change the glycine into alanine, which is a very small change, it drops. Myosin is a contraction protein in the muscles. It drops down to only 1% capacity to contract, just with that one small change. Collagen is loaded with glycine, and so we have a lot of issues with collagen, with our bones, with our joints, a lot of arthritis, fatty liver disease, obesity and adrenal insufficiency, impaired iron homeostasis, kidney failure, insulin resistance, diabetes, and cancer. All of these things can be explained through this mechanism. So this is just an example with the cytochrome P450 enzymes. It's been shown, and I'll show the next slides, that studies have shown that it suppresses these enzymes. They have a unique sequence, a signature, FXXG, XRXCXG. Those two red Gs, those are glycines. There has to be glycine in those particular spots in that sequence, a motif, which has, that shows the 2 glycines, but many of them actually have 3 glycines. Over on the right, you can see those green Gs. This is the pattern of the sequence of amino acids in all these different CYP enzymes over here on the right. And on the bottom, I just have little arrows on those Gs. You can see all those glycines that have to be there in order for that protein to work properly. And I mentioned all these roles before: bile acids, vitamin D activation, synthesizing estrogen, metabolizing vitamin A, and then detoxifying toxic chemicals. So they have many, many important roles in the liver as well as elsewhere in the body. Here's a study that showed inhibition of cytochrome P450 enzymes, various chemicals that they studied, 2,4-D, clofibrate, MCPA, and glyphosate. And you can see here in the chart, glyphosate was the one that suppressed the activity the most of all these chemicals that they looked at in the rat liver. So here's a recent paper, brand new paper, 2018, that is showing that glyphosate exposure reduces the length of pregnancy, so it can cause a premature birth. And of course, premature birth is associated with a lot of risk factors for other problems. This was a study that was done in Indiana. And they measured glyphosate in the urine. The first thing to notice is that 93% of the 71 women that they had in their study tested positive for glyphosate in their urine. That's a very high number, 93%. And then the rural areas, people from rural areas had higher levels. Higher urinary glyphosate was correlated with shorter gestation with a significant p-value of 0.02. And they suspected that it could be due to hormonal disruptions because aromatase, which is a CYP enzyme, is suppressed by glyphosate. That's been shown in studies, and that one is converts testosterone into estrogen. So you're going to have an estrogen deficiency. And also the defective CYP enzymes prevent the metabolism of retinoic acid, so you can get retinoic acid toxicity. I want to showcase Anthony Samsel. I've been working with him now for ever since I first learned about glyphosate. Interesting person. He lives up in New Hampshire on his own organic farm, which he just grows food to feed his family. He's a retired, he worked at the Arthur D. Little research tank for many, many years as a chemist. He's a toxicologist chemist, retired now, but still active as a consultant. And he's been doing his own experiments. He's been measuring glyphosate in all kinds of interesting places: bile acids, horses' hooves, fingernails, spinal disc of someone with a spinal defective spine, baby teeth. He's finding it in all of these places. So it is accumulating all over our bodies. It actually goes, Monsanto's studies show that it's the highest concentrations are in the bones, which is very scary, particularly the bone marrow, because that's where the immune cells emerge from the bone marrow carrying glyphosate on their backs. He has a lovely quote here, which I want to read. "Glyphosate is not toxic in the conventional sense. It destroys our biology at the cellular level, one molecule at a time. through disruption of proteins and signaling. Integration of glyphosate with globular and structural proteins is how it can be the cause of an endless array of unrelated diseases and unleash a cascade of ill health effects that kill us like a slow cumulative poison. So I showed you, I think, something about dementia and glyphosate. Here it is again, very, very good match between dementia and glyphosate. I looked into the proteins associated with dementia, and of course you have amyloid beta plaque, which is very, very much a part of the Alzheimer's story. And that comes from a protein called amyloid precursor protein. That protein has a transmembrane segment that contains a very unique motif with this pattern. The X's mean wild cards. That could be any amino acid. GXXX, GXXX, GXXXG. So 4 glycines absolutely required for this protein to work properly. And those glycines are essential for forming this alpha helix structure that allows it to go into the membrane. So when those glycines are replaced by glyphosate, that protein will misfold into beta sheets and will not be able to go into the membrane. And then you will end up with Alzheimer's because it'll turn into this plaque. So this is a paper that I recently published, very recently, just came out with Laura Orlando. It's called Glyphosate Substitution for Glycine During Protein Synthesis as a Causal Factor in Mesoamerican Nephropathy. Mesoamerican nephropathy is a kidney failure problem that is showing up among the agricultural workers in Nicaragua and El Salvador. They're working in the sugarcane fields. And it's a very puzzling disease. It's not a normal kind of kidney failure. And they're young. They're like men in their 40s. They have families. And they're dying in record numbers. So it's a very serious problem, and people are trying to figure out what's causing it. I believe glyphosate is a key factor in this disease. It's sprayed, the sugarcane is sprayed with glyphosate a few weeks before harvest in order as a ripener. So it's not a GMO Roundup ready crop, but it's sprayed as a ripener. And then it's burned right before the harvest. And then these guys come in after it's been burned, so they're getting it both from the fumes in the air, as well as they eat the sugarcane as they're working. So they're getting it from the sugarcane that they're eating as well. And they're working in a very hot climate, with insufficient water and that sort of thing. So they get into other issues that then drive them towards this failure mode, because certain proteins are expressed under these stress conditions, and they get glyphosate in them, and then they don't work. And so very, very interesting to look at the different proteins that would be affected, you could expect, would be affected given this disease. And we showed, I can quote from the paper, specifically glycine substitution in aquaporin, chloride channels, cytochrome C oxidase, and collagen, among others, could contribute to dehydration, increased urinary acidification, kidney fibrosis, rhabdomyolysis, and mitochondrial dysfunction. So all of these problems will come about once you're in this stress condition, because of the effect of glyphosate on the proteins that are being synthesized. This was one that I learned from Don Huber. Anencephaly was an epidemic during a period of time in Yakima, Washington. And during that same period of time, turned out they were using glyphosate to control the weeds in the waterways. So they studied 75 different pesticides to try to figure out. They thought maybe pesticides could be causing this anencephaly epidemic. That's a child being born without a brain. And they found 63% of them were detected. Glyphosate was applied in large amounts, but was not studied at all because it was considered harmless. And so they used it around the irrigation ditches to control the weeds. And it was the main herbicide that was recommended because of its low toxicity. However, glyphosate has been linked to anencephaly due to its effect on retinoic acid. And this is a study from Carrasco showing microcephaly in tadpoles exposed to glyphosate. And so they have this picture, this comes from their paper, where the glyphosate is suppressing the CYP enzymes, which should be clearing the retinoic acid, but it's not happening. So the retinoic acid builds up in toxic levels and then causes all of these different effects over here on the right, having to do with misdevelopment of the facial region, one of which is microcephaly. So this is a paper that I wrote together with Gregory Nye, was published recently, 2017. Glyphosate and anencephaly, death by 1,000 cuts. And again, we looked into all the different proteins that are associated with anencephaly and looking for glycine, specifically looking for glycine residues that would be disrupted. And so this has a whole list of proteins here on the left. I'm not going to read them to you. And you can see on the right is all the different glycine-related motifs that these proteins have, that if you swap out that glycine, it doesn't work. So we're basically using this strategy of digging through the research literature, finding the proteins, finding the ones that have the specific glycines, and then seeing if they associate with diseases that glyphosate is correlated with. And we're finding a perfect match. This is why I really believe that we're right about this. So food allergies and autoimmune diseases. Autoimmune disease is an invisible epidemic, and it's really a big problem in our country. Taken together, the number of people suffering from autoimmune diseases is 24 to 50 million Americans, which is 16% of our population. And so autoimmune disease prevalence is equivalent to heart disease and cancer combined. So a very, very serious problem that we face with autoimmune diseases. The healthcare costs for autoimmune disease is estimated to be $100 billion a year. This one says at least 23.5 million Americans suffer from one or more autoimmune diseases. It's among the top 10 causes of death in females under 64 years old. And then it's treated with immunosuppressants, but they have a lot of devastating side effects. So why do we have an epidemic in autoimmune disease in America today? I think it has to do with glyphosate. Glyphosate exposure, first of all, sets up a weakened immune system, a leaky gut barrier, and a leaky brain barrier. And when the proteins are contaminated with glyphosate, they're difficult to break down. That includes both your food proteins, it also includes proteins in viruses, and it includes your own proteins in your own body. All of them are going to be, first of all, misfolding, and secondly, hard to break down. And this is going to set them up to cause your immune cells to reject them. They no longer consider them to be natural human proteins, or even the food proteins are not the same as they were before because of the glyphosate contamination. Glyphosate also disrupts the pancreatic enzymes that break down the proteins. So even if the protein that you're eating is not affected by glyphosate, if it doesn't get broken down, it can get loose into your general circulation, and that will cause an immune reaction. So the person develops an overactive antibody response to this foreign protein that's contaminated with glyphosate. And then there's a mechanism called molecular mimicry, whereby your own proteins resemble the protein that your immune cells are reacting to. And then you get your immune system attacks your own proteins, the ones that resemble the ones that are in the food. So this easily explains gluten intolerance and other food allergies. And we have I'm just amazed at how many different food allergies we have among our children today in this country. When kids go to school and they can't even bring a peanut butter sandwich because likely somebody in their class is allergic to peanuts. We have so many issues with peanuts and soy and egg allergies and milk allergies and gluten intolerance, corn allergies, all these different foods. All of these foods can be expected to be contaminated with glyphosate given how they're produced. So so I did a paper. Anthony and I have done 6 papers together so far. We're working on the 7th one right now. And the third, I think this was the second one, was on celiac disease. And here we show a plot of the black line is glyphosate usage on wheat, not corn and soy, but wheat. And the yellow boxes are celiac disease. And so the match isn't quite as perfect as it is for autism, but it's a pretty impressive match between those two. And which makes me believe that celiac disease could be caused. The epidemic in celiac disease could be caused by glyphosate. And when you look, you can see that that might be true because gluten intolerance results from an inability to break down the gluten. And gluten is a difficult protein to break down, partly because it has a lot of proline molecules, and prolines are hard to break. The bonds of prolines are hard to break. So there's a specialized enzyme that does this, but that enzyme depends on manganese, and manganese is made unavailable because of glyphosate chelating it. And that protein also contains 3 separate regions that have highly conserved glycine residues, so that's an opportunity to disrupt it right there. So then when you have malabsorption, you end up with nutritional deficiencies, and it can lead to symptoms of autism, and autistic kids have a high rate of celiac disease and gluten intolerance. Wheat is routinely sprayed with glyphosate right before the harvest as a desiccant, just like sugarcane. And people have been testing wheat-based products like bread, Oreo cookies, and they're finding high levels of glyphosate in these products. Oreo cookies and bread. So other plants include sugarcane, barley, peanuts, maize, and legumes. So a lot of different plants are being sprayed with glyphosate right before the harvest. In fact, the legumes are turning out to have extremely high levels of glyphosate, according to tests being done in Canada. So collagen and gelatin, my next topic. 25% of the protein in our body is collagen. Collagen is a really important protein. It's really the glue of your body. It's in all of your connective tissue and in your skin, in your bones, in your joints. 25% of the amino acids in collagen are glycine residues. So collagen is incredibly enriched in glycine. Now, of course, this means it's very vulnerable to glyphosate contamination. Glyphosate substitution for glycine will disrupt its triple helix formation, which could lead to diseases of the vasculature, joints, and bones. Gelatin is derived from collagen in the bones and ligaments of cows and pigs that are fed heavy doses of glyphosate in their feed. So you can expect gelatin to also be contaminated with glyphosate. And so these are some of the products that contain gelatin. One of the things I'm very concerned about is vaccines. You also have the gel caps, Jell-O, of course, various facial products. All of these things contain gelatin, and gelatin is likely to be contaminated with glyphosate. And in fact, Anthony Samsel, this is from the 6th paper that we wrote together, which was published in 2017, last year. And Anthony actually got some bones from the butcher and from cows and measured those, found glyphosate in them. He found glyphosate in the ligaments, he found glyphosate in collagen and gelatin, and he found glyphosate in vaccines, which is terrifying to me. So especially the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine, the MMR vaccine, had the highest level of all the vaccines that he measured. And it was pretty much found in the live virus vaccines, but not in the vaccines that were based on inactivated viral proteins. So it was consistent with the live virus. The live virus vaccines are grown on gelatin and on fetal bovine serum, both of which can be expected to be contaminated with glyphosate. And I think that this explains some of the severe reactions that we're seeing. We're seeing a lot more severe reactions to MMR these days than we did back in the 1990s. And I think it's because there's much more glyphosate in the vaccine now than there was then. The suspected link between MMR and autism can be explained through an autoimmune attack on the myelin sheath following exposure to glyphosate-contaminated antigen in the vaccine. And in fact, in our paper, we talk about how the particular antigen that's in the MMR, the measles antigen, that's supposed to develop a measles antibody for the vaccine to take, that antigen contains glycine. And if it gets messed up by glyphosate, it's going to be much more allergenic. And then the child actually develops an antibody to its myelin basic protein because of the similarity in the peptide sequence between those two proteins. A very scary situation. In fact, there was Professor Singh at Utah State University wrote several papers going back to the 1990s on the idea of the MMR vaccine causing autism through this mechanism without ever knowing anything about glyphosate. He already had this idea, and I think it's a very good idea, and I think it can explain the link that we're seeing between MMR and autism. Rheumatoid arthritis is another serious disease with inflammation in the joints, which causes pain, limits movements, can lead to lung fibrosis, increases the risk to atherosclerosis, heart attack, and stroke. There's poor iron absorption. You get anemia of chronic disease, fatigue, low-grade fever, malaise, morning stiffness, loss of appetite, loss of weight. So generally not something you want to have. And this, I think, can be due to glyphosate getting into the collagen in your joints. So now we have an epidemic today in opioid drug abuse, and I suspect that's also connected to this problem of glyphosate getting into proteins. It's causing a tremendous amount of pain. And so people are taking opioid drugs to try to cope with their pain and ending up with addiction and then overdose and then death. More people died from drug overdoses in 2014 than in any previous year on record. More than 6 out of 10 involved an opioid drug, as opposed to like heroin, so a pharmaceutical drug. And more than 650,000 opioid prescriptions are dispensed every day. So animals in distress. Lots and lots of species are in trouble today, I'm sure you know. These are some of the more well-known ones: the bees, the butterflies. The bats in New England have this white nose disease. You can see a fungus growing on their nose. The ladybug, there used to be so many ladybugs when I was a child, and I hardly ever see a ladybug anymore. And they're really useful for controlling aphids. They probably are eating aphids that are contaminated with glyphosate and dying from that. The frogs have just had a miserable time, all kinds of issues with their development because they're very sensitive to the toxic chemicals. There's a strange problem with the starfish off the West Coast with this kind of melting disease that I suspect has to do with glyphosate exposure because of using glyphosate on the oyster beds. They actually use glyphosate on the oyster beds, and the starfish are trying to eat the oysters, and they end up contaminated with glyphosate. Now, many of these are related to fungus infection. They really are blaming fungus as the problem, and fungus is a problem. But I think the fungus problem is being aggravated by the glyphosate. And this is a paper from, don't have the date here, do I? I would mess it up, I guess. That's interesting. There's no date on that, but I think it's about 2014, 2015. From Nature Reviews. This was an interesting paper that talked about all the different epidemic we're seeing in extinction of different plant and animal species. The red lines are for the animals and the green lines are for the plants. So the plants are being more affected than the animals here on that top picture on the left. You can see all the dots on the right showing where these are most affected, and you can see that the United States has an extremely dense population of dots, meaning that we're really suffering more than other countries from this extinction problem. And the causes of extinction here on the bottom left, you see that big red circle that's most of the pie is fungi. So the fungi are definitely causing issues with extinction here, here, and here. And so, but the fungi are overgrowing, I believe, because of glyphosate's effect on the microbes. Glyphosate is disturbing the microbial balance, preferentially killing the bacteria. And in our gut, this is happening too. And so we have a problem with yeast infection. We have a problem with toxic mold. This is all because we're much more sensitive to these things than we would have been if we didn't have glyphosate in our gut. So here's a quote from this paper. In both animals and plants, an unprecedented number of fungal and fungal-like diseases have recently caused some of the most severe die-offs and extinctions ever witnessed in wild species and are jeopardizing food security. So aflatoxin is a toxin produced by fungi that is incredibly toxic. And Roundup, this paper talks about Roundup herbicide enhancing the growth of aflatoxin-producing fungi. Aflatoxins are mutagenic, carcinogenic, teratogenic, hepatotoxic, immunosuppressive, and they also inhibit several metabolic systems. So that's about as bad as you can get. It's pretty much disrupting everything. I wrote a paper together with Judy Hoy and Nancy Swanson. Judy Hoy is a very interesting woman. She lives in western Montana. She has spent her entire life studying the wild animals of western Montana and watching their degradation over time. She actually finds dead animals and looks at their organs and finds disturbances, and she's been documenting their gradual decline. And she just recently published a book called Changing Faces that I highly recommend, sort of about the story of her experience with these animals and their degradation and her concern about the toxic chemicals that are being used on agriculture, which are destroying the wild animals in her environment. In this paper, she have a lot of pictures of documentary pictures of her experiences with these animals, as well as looking at correlation trends of diseases with glyphosate among both humans and animals. So we tied it to the human infants as well to show the story for both our own children and the young animals. And this is just one example of a plot from that paper, Congenital Heart Defects. This actually shows both congenital heart conditions among children. That's the blue line. And then the green line is enlarged right ventricle among adults. So both the children and adults are getting affected with respect to heart disturbances. The red boxes are glyphosate on wheat, corn, and soy, glyphosate usage in this country. So all three of those line up very well. It's just another example. We have so many examples of these trends of all these rising diseases correlated with the rise in glyphosate usage. So finally, last section, what you can do. Number one, go organic. When my husband and I go shopping for groceries, we won't buy it if it doesn't say certified organic. We're very strict. Our spices, our wine, our beer, all of our foods, everything is certified organic. Or we get grass-fed beef. Everything is the highest quality we can find. I think it's worth it to spend the extra money to try to reduce your exposure to glyphosate. There are some probiotics are very helpful for fixing the gut. So I didn't talk a lot about this. I have in other talks about glyphosate disrupting the gut microbes, but it tends to kill off the beneficial bacteria, and it allows the pathogens to overgrow, like Clostridia species in particular. Sauerkraut and apple cider vinegar contain Acetobacter, and Acetobacter is among the very few microbes that are able to fully metabolize glyphosate. So they can actually clear the glyphosate from your gut. So I think it's a good idea to eat some vinegar, have a salad with some vinegar on it, some organic apple cider vinegar. We like to use this Bragg's before your dinner, or just as you start your dinner, and then you'll have that vinegar there to help clear out any glyphosate that might be in your food. I love Zen Honeycutt. She founded the organization Moms Across America. She's a dynamo, and she's just recently published this book, Unstoppable. It's just come out. I have a copy. And she has been helping to get mothers engaged to go bring awareness. You know, that she does all these kinds of meetups and stuff. She's trying to do all these things she can to engage people. She also goes to the Monsanto meetings of the, she's very brave in going places and making herself seen and saying, I want this stuff, going to the government, wherever she can find a way to get the message out, she's working on that. She has 3 young boys, and one of them was diagnosed with autism, and she reversed it by putting him on an organic diet. So you can also, of course, people can give talks, and this is was a headline for a talk from Dr. Stephen France, who's in California. He's been advocating for banning glyphosate in California. This town is a great example. I really hope that this town will be a message to other towns in the neighborhood to say we can ban it town by town, one town at a time. We can get rid of this stuff. And I think it's really wonderful whenever one town does it, and I'm hoping you guys will, then it will inspire other towns to follow suit. Fixing the soil is super, super important. I think Don Huber may talk more about this. He knows a lot more than I do. This is just some material that I found from this Missouri farmer, J.R. Bollinger. He grew a corn and soy farm. He grew corn and soy on a former coal mine. So apparently a coal mine is a very difficult place to start with really bad soil. And so he basically played with different ways to fix the soil. And he used humates and sea minerals and microbes and fish meal and biochar powder. These are all things that will probably also be useful to help heal your own gut. So I think a lot of what you use to fix the soil is the same thing you can use to fix your own gut, because the microbes in the soil and the microbes in the gut have a lot in common. He added earthworms to make sure they could till the soil microbes, which are crucial for soil health. And then he found that he greatly reduced the fertilizer needs and improved the yield on the crops. So he's altogether, it's really important to spend the extra time and money to make the soil healthy, and then everything else will follow. It'll make it much easier to control everything else. Obviously, small organic farms are the answer, and this is a beautiful farm from Bluebird Hill in North Carolina. And finally, a hopeful quote. It's interesting that in 2016, for the first time in almost 20 years, what we saw is a decrease in the amount of acreage where genetically engineered crops are growing around the world. This represents the fact that this technology is failing in the sense of superweeds and superpests are popping up all over the world. And I'm sort of grateful to the weeds, because I think eventually the weeds will become so good at fighting back that glyphosate will have to be discontinued just because it's not working. And I don't mind whatever way we get rid of it, as long as we get rid of it. In summary, glyphosate is pervasive in our food supply today. Contrary to popular belief, it's insidiously, cumulatively toxic to all life forms, including humans. Time trends in glyphosate usage on core crops are correlated with an alarming rise in a large number of debilitating diseases, including autism, Alzheimer's, and cancer. Glyphosate's insidious toxicity is likely mediated through substitution for glycine during protein synthesis by mistake. This explains the causal relationship with multiple diseases, particularly autoimmune diseases and neurological diseases. Glyphosate is likely a major factor in antibiotic resistance. Glyphosate in collagen leads to opioid drug epidemic. Glyphosate explains the epidemic in kidney failure among sugarcane workers. Glyphosate urgently needs to be banned worldwide. Thank you for your time.